Well, hi again. Welcome to So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show. I did that without the banner this week. This this week, we're talking about using SEO data to place sponsored content. So I'm joined by Chris and John, and today we're going to be talking about how to look at traffic on third-party sites to see if it's worth trying to get your content placed. Deciding if sponsored content is even worth the money. That's a big question that comes up a lot. So we'll talk about that. And then alternative options to sponsored content. So if sponsored content isn't the right thing, what do you do instead? So that's what we're covering today. So Chris, where do you want to start?
Let's start by being clear about what we mean when we say sponsored content, because there's a lot of different advertising options in this case. So I guess we should give some backstory. Over in our friends at Spin Sucks, they have a Slack. So do we. You can see ours at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. The Spin Sucks Slack. I don't actually have Jenny's invite, but someone was asking about like a competing PR agency was saying we can guarantee a story placement in Business Insider for only X dollars or whatever, and guaranteed results in 2 weeks. And logically, for folks who have been in the PR industry, we know that they're not getting a story placed with the journalist; they're just buying some content. So what that would look like, what we mean by sponsored content. Here's an example. This is from the BBC. The BBC has a division called Storyworks. And companies come in. This one's paid by some company called Roborock, and they create content that looks like BBC content. Strange person, I guess the executive of some kind, robot vacuum, etc. And it looks like a really nice, well-placed piece of coverage, but of course it is paid. Here's another example. This is on Business Insight. You can see here, this is created by Insider Studios with this company, and this looks very, very much like Business Insider's typical content, same format and everything. It just does have that little bit of disclosure towards the end there, and little tag. So when we talk about sponsored content, this is what we mean.
So Chris, at the top of this article, it does actually say sponsored content.
Yep.
So is that something that has to be disclosed if it is sponsored content? Like, are there rules around that?
There are rules. The FTC has created rules around basically any form of advertising has to be disclosed as advertising.
Okay. So, all right.
So
So now that we know what sponsored content is, so, we get, unsolicited emails all the time from people trying to, get us to pay money to get our stuff shown, so what's the value of paying to get your content instead of doing it organically?
Um, well, there's two schools of thought about this. One is, you're guaranteed an outcome of some kind, namely getting your stuff in here. In the world of public relations, this is really important because an awful lot of the time, the stories that companies are pitching really aren't news, right? In fact, there's far from new and news as you can get, and they're not particularly compelling. And so, if you're a PR practitioner, for example, and you just know that your company or your clients' news is anything but, this is an attractive option to satisfy, say, like a senior executive who's like, I need to see my stuff in Business Insider. We're like, okay, give us 20 grand and we'll make sure it appears there. And there's little to no chance of the publication picking it up otherwise. The other thing is, if you have the capability to analyze different types of sponsored content and see what kind of traffic they get, you might find that some kinds of sponsored content, particularly on industry or niche publications, may make good sense because the readers are there and are going to see it anyway.
Now, how about some of the sponsored content? I mean, really, with the exception of it saying sponsor at the top, I mean, it seems like digitally it's exactly the same as the organic stuff. So, are there any real differences?
Other than the disclosures, a lot of the companies that put together sponsored content really want it to look like the organic news.
Well, all right.
So much.
Go ahead.
So much so that a few have gotten in trouble over, every now and again for not being sufficiently upfront about disclosing, like, this was paid for by so and so.
It's one of those things, and I'm sort of putting myself in the shoes of the consumer right now. Like when I don't, as I'm reading articles, I don't look for, is it sponsored or is it not? So I don't look for, did a company pay to put their content here, or did they have a really good comms team who was able to get it placed for them? I look for, is the article relevant to me and do I get anything out of it? So as a consumer, I don't care if it's sponsored or not. So I can understand, the company wants to get it out there to as many people as possible, but crappy content is crappy content. It doesn't mean that people are going to respond to it. So, it's sort of the thing that we always kind of go back to is like, well, if you write really good content, then that's like the hard part is over. Like people will want to read it, but that's a whole other thing. But yeah, as a consumer, I don't care if it's sponsored or not. I care if it's useful.
And that is the pitch that a lot of ad tech companies and advertising brokers and companies like Business Insider will say. It's like, look, your content's going to show up like any of our other content. The consumer doesn't care. Sometimes they can't even tell the difference, not because we're doing anything malicious, but just because people don't pay attention to that stuff. So why not buy the full page placement that you really want, rather than pestering our writers?
Yeah, and if your SEO plan is, hey, we need X number of inbound links, I mean, you can't just buy your way into that.
Exactly. So after our friends told us about this ad firm, because they claim to be a PR firm, but they're just really selling advertising, we had the question, well, what if that's the right choice? Like, as much as it's, I have the temptation to make fun of such tactics, we don't know, could they be right? Like, could they actually say, like, yeah, sponsored content works, and you're better off paying the $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 for a guaranteed placement than banging your head against the wall. So what we wanted to know was, well, how would you know? Like, how would you know that some content does better than others? One of the things you'll note here, and you can see it in the URL. The URL here has a little SC in it. That's Business Insider's way of saying our sponsored content is stored in this URL structure. When you go to the BBC, theirs is bbc.com/storyworks. So the storyworks is always highlighted in the URL. So if we were to extract a random sampling of pages from all these publications, we would be able to get some of the sponsored stuff and a bunch of the unsponsored stuff as well. And then we can take a look and see what is the difference between these two types of content. So the way that you would get to that would be through an SEO tool. And we use at our shop the Ahrefs software. I still can't rock the fact that the first part of that name is silent. But well, I would pronounce Ahrefs, like Ahrefs. Anyway,
it's one of the great mysteries of the universe, how a company that does nothing but marketing has a rough time coming up with a name that people can say.
And so in a system like this, I can go in and say, I want to see pages from a site like Business Insider. Now, the challenge that we're going to run into is there's a lot of them. There's almost 600,000. And only a certain percentage are going to be sponsored or unsponsored. So what we need to do is extract a lot of these pages, if not all of them. In this case, I've already done the repeated exports to get to a rough sample of these pages, and then we need to look at the URLs and say, what's the difference? So there is a way to do this. Like, if you wanted to do this in Microsoft Excel, you could. It would be an extremely large spreadsheet, but you can do it. Yeah, you can do it. You would copy and paste all this, and then you could start doing math on the different columns. Katie, you look puzzled.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, is there a more straightforward way? Can someone do it within the tool and just filter it down to the URLs that only have SC in them? Or, can they export the data and then just filter by only the URLs that have SC and look at, the relative, traffic to those pages?
The second part of what you're talking about is exactly what we're going to do. So we're going to we're going to filter by the URLs to get a sense of what is it. Now, I'm going to use R because it's a lot faster than watching me copy and paste for 20 minutes. But if you don't use R, you can do exactly what Katie just said and put it on a big old Excel spreadsheet. And then use statements like count if and stuff to count whether that, the SC is in the URL. And so let's go ahead and clean things up here. Let's start with Business Insider. I'm going to take the Business Insider content. I'm going to load it all up. And we should get, what do we got here? We have 55,000 pages total, of which 41,000 are unique. And we know that the SC sets this as sponsored content. So if we were to summarize all the different metrics, oops, I forgot the ion group statement there. Let's take a look at just this quick summary. Sponsored. We're going to use hrefs. We're going to use two metrics. One, the traffic that hrefs thinks that page gets. And they get that data from things like Bitly clicks from third parties, from some of their own data collection efforts. And then the number of tweets of that URL, people tweeting that URL. And so those are, I think, two decent measures for trying to understand. Another one that we could look at if you wanted to would be referring domains. If you wanted to see, like, does sponsored content get you more incoming links? But for now, we're going to leave that off. For Business Insider, we see that sponsored content, non-sponsored content gets an average of 922 visits per page and gets about 60 tweets on average. Sponsored content gets 37 visits, almost 38 visits per page, and about one tweet. So there's a pretty big difference there.
Yeah, obviously that seems like you're just getting killed if you're sponsoring the content. It's like 30 times the traffic, 60 times the Twitter heat.
Right. And if we look, let's go do a bit more digging. Let's take a look at just the top 25 non-sponsored stories first. Let's see what that looks like, just to get a sense of what's in the news, right? We have, Last Kingdom is Netflix's latest binge-worthy British thing, the Dow Jones Index, something from the election, because this is all of 2021. The Dow Jones 30, how to log into Facebook. And so these are stories that get a lot of traffic, hundreds of thousands of visits. 30% off Kohl's coupons. I didn't know Kohl's was that big of a deal, but
you go,
there
Kohl's.
You go. The best lingerie in 2021, Bitcoin prices, how to loop a YouTube video. What does NSFW mean? 126,000 people are looking for reading it. I give up on people.
So it's basic. So this doesn't tell us anything because it's all over the place.
Exactly. So this this gives you a general sense of what non-sponsored content is most popular on Business Insider. One of the things that would be a logical thing to ask if you are a company looking, like we were looking to place some content, is this even the right audience? Right? Based on what people are reading here, I'm not sure.
Yeah, my opinion of this hard-hitting news is really kind of bugging me.
And now let's do the same thing, but let's look at sponsored content and try and get a sense of like what kind of stuff is popular in the sponsored realm, if anything. This is really interesting. So one story, Sam's Club, the benefits to using the Sam's Club credit card did decent, 1,600 visits. And then all the other stuff, not so much.
It's funny that totally matches with the Kohl's 30% off thing, though. It's like the same content, really.
Right. Exactly. So from, this is a site called Business Insider. You would think it would be more
businessy, yeah.
So this is one example. We can see here, obviously IBM has done a couple of pieces. We see a whole bunch of sort of what you would expect actually is probably blog content that somebody repurposed, right? How retailers can succeed in e-commerce in China. Just smells like a blog post. Like somebody borrowed from their corporate blog.
What's interesting is, at least as at a first glance, is that the titles of the sponsored content are less actionable, I guess. Maybe that's not the right word, but they're less like how to do this and what's this and 10 ways to do this. Whereas the unsponsored content is more of the like help content, it feels like.
Yeah.
Like how to log into Facebook, 30% off, 10 simple ways. And that's not true of all of them. There's still a lot of weird stuff in here that, like, I don't know why I would read the article, but at least these ones seem to me a little bit more that they actually tell you what the article's about.
Mm-hmm. Right. Which I think that's an important content marketing lesson in itself, is like, if you're going to spend a lot of money on sponsored content, maybe, try to make it as appealing as the stuff that we know does well. Whether or not we want to read about these things, any one of these individual topics, you're right. At least, like this one here, chainsaws were originally invented for helping with, I will definitely go and read what the rest of that's about. It sounds fun. So that's Business Insider. Based on what we've seen so far, I'm kind of feeling like that would be a no for me. Like the difference is too big there. So let's take a look at the BBCs now. We're going to rerun the same thing. We'll load up the BBC data. In this case, we've got about 20,000 articles. Here at the BBC, 17 visits for sponsored content, and then about 2 tweets. And for non-sponsored content, about 3,000 visits and 61 tweets. So again, BBC articles here. Clearly, the non-sponsored has a lot more juice. Let's go ahead and look at the top stories on the non-sponsored.
What's considered a top story?
By traffic, ordered by the amount of traffic. Sean Connery dies, the Canadian election, fake photos, Kim Jong-un, what exactly is a Karen and where did the meme come from? So this is very much, you can tell, general news with a distinct weight towards world news, very which you would expect at the BBC.
Well, it also speaks to the squirrel brain that we all have of like, ooh, shiny thing, ooh, shiny thing, ooh, shiny thing. Like, again, it's a little more news, but it's still all over the place.
Right, exactly. It's, TikTok overtakes YouTube for average watch time in the US. It's actually is mildly interesting.
Not really.
Mildly. Okay, let's take a look at StoryWorks and see how does BBC StoryWorks match up. Okay, already better than Business Insider. That was a bunch of zeros for afterwards. But here, some tourism stuff. More tourism. Isn't that interesting? There's a lot of tourism stuff in their sponsorship, but it does decent. It's not a zero.
Yeah, and like Katie was saying with the other titles, these titles are way more compelling.
Yeah, how to beat jet lag, travel in the COVID-19 world. So there's other stuff like how technology is transforming Japanese agriculture. That's not as compelling, but yeah, it's definitely in a somewhat improved quality. So even though the traffic numbers are not great for this, it's certainly better than Business Insider's was. Okay, let's do one more. Let's do BuzzFeed, everybody's favorite short attention span theater.
It's going to be all quizzes.
Probably. This is really interesting. The difference is much narrower. 11 visits for sponsored content, 92 visits for not. Less than a half a tweet for sponsored content, and 2 for not. So there's a pretty sizable difference here in terms of the content. So let's take a look at the top traffic. Let's see if
half
Katie
tweet says that like 70 X characters.
And this is definitely clickbait content. 100% clickbait content. All celebrities.
Pop culture.
Yeah, exactly. It's all pop culture stuff. 72 keto-friendly Trader Joe's products.
What is your spirit animal? There you go.
Well, that's what those
celebrity tweets you missed last week. Yep, I'm gonna lose sleep over that.
So okay, there's definitely a clear audience for this content. Let's take a look at their sponsored content now and see if we can figure out what's going on with that.
The fact that the headline, "The longer you take to complete this quiz, the dumber you are," the fact that that gets clicks,
Yep.
really bothers me.
Now, what's interesting about BuzzFeed is that BuzzFeed doesn't necessarily do placed content. What they do is they allow a company to sponsor an article. So like that's what is your spirit animal? If you were to go into that quiz, it is sponsored by I think it was like Ragu or something like that. Some thing. So there are definitely some stories that do well. But in this case, again, not zeros like Business Insiders was, but also not nearly the size. But this is very much in line with the rest of their content and stuff. And so we can see like the 24 things about fall that will put a smile on your face. What's your superhero power? Best moments in punk history, etc. So these are things that are pieces that other companies have sponsored just to get their brand in front of an audience. So in all three cases, I think it's safe to say we can conclude that the amount of traffic that a sponsored content piece gets is substantially lower than a non-sponsored piece. So if you are working with a public relations agency, and they're talking about, is it better to just buy your way in? At least from a traffic perspective, the answer is no.
Well, and the feedback from so to be clear, this group of people right here, we are not comms and PR professionals. And so we look at it from a data standpoint, but the feedback from the actual PR pros in that conversation was that, sponsored content is not the right strategic move because it lessens the value of the work that they do. And I agree with that because there's a reason that job function exists. And if companies can just pay to get really crappy content on a website that someone else has been working hard to get placed organically, that's a really stellar piece of content, like, yeah, it does seem a little bit like the sponsored content is like a cheat. And I get that it's not a true cheat. Like if you have the money to pony up to do it, then that's fine. But then why are these people over here busting their butts to try to get the same result?
Yeah, a part of that I think also goes to when you're advertising, you're effectively putting your content in front of somebody else. Whereas when you're getting coverage of it, you're getting essentially an implicit third-party endorsement. You're saying that the publication, without taking money for it, thought your news was newsworthy enough that it deserved some shelf space. Whereas if you have to buy your way in, it's true, not everybody pays attention to those tags, but it's clear that if the story that you had to share was good enough, it would have made its way into the publication already from an unpaid perspective.
So I think that brings us to the last point that we wanted to cover is what are the alternatives that people can take aside from just writing better content? What are some, but in all seriousness, what are the alternatives to sponsored content? I mean, it's obviously getting a really great comms team and PR team who can pitch like nobody's business. It's writing, really solid, useful content that people actually want to read. What are some other things that people can do as opposed to just defaulting to sponsored content?
One of the things that I think the public relations industry has not thought enough about is that influencer marketing includes them, not just in the sense of, I as a PR person, I'm going to go help recruit influencers for a company and share the stuff. I think that certainly is valid, but PR people don't think of themselves as the influencers, right? If you have strong relationships with so-and-so at the New York Times and so-and-so at the Wall Street Journal and so-and-so at the Boston Business Journal, and you can reliably get them to pick up the phone when you call them, you are an influencer, right? You are an influencer. And as such, you can extend your influence to take the client's story, hopefully tell the client, yes, this is newsworthy, or guys, come up with something better. I know John's just not, at the Marketing Over Coffee podcast is not going to want to cover this because it's like you and 8,000 other companies do exactly the same thing. But if you have something that's truly actually news, then I can go and use my relationship, my influence with John to get that story covered on the Marketing Over Coffee podcast. And I think that's a mindset that PR people have not figured out yet, that they are influencers. They don't have to have big personal brands and be, Instagram celebrities and stuff like that, but they do have to have those relationships. And the definition of influence is that you can get somebody to do something through persuasion as opposed to swiping a credit card.
Well, and that I think we're starting to go down like the road of like what defines an influencer. And, you're talking about in two different contexts. And so when you're talking about, the PR industry as a whole, a lot of it is about relationship building and networking and trust of, yeah, if you get my story placed, you can trust me, then I'm going to continue to give you good stories for your publication. That to me is different from, what people typically think of influencers now is I have a big reach of people. So if I hold up a makeup brush, 5,000 people are going to buy it. Those are two different contexts. So I wouldn't use the word influencer in the context that you're talking about. What you're really talking about is those relationships, those interpersonal relationships that need to exist in order for someone in the PR space to be successful.
Exactly. But to your point about what are the alternatives to sponsored content, yeah, the creation of quality content is important, but part and parcel of that is that you as a generator of content also develop that relationship with the publication. If the PR person may make the introduction, but then you may change agencies or change staff or things like that. But if you are known to the publisher, whoever it is, then as long as you continue to create really interesting stuff, you can get seen, right? So, and you don't have to pay for it, but it takes time and effort to build those relationships. Like we just did a piece yesterday on the top marketing technologies used by 8,000 companies in Scott Brinker's MarTech landscape. Because we have a relationship with Scott, because we have a relationship with the MarTech organization and the MarTech conference, and because we consistently create content that is actually news, it was relatively straightforward to tag him in a LinkedIn post, and have him then go reshare it on Twitter and stuff like that, and get the story placed, right? So we didn't have to work hard at this campaign. What we do have to work hard at is maintaining that relationship over time. So a big part of making sure your content goes somewhere is you got to work on the relationships.
What do you think, John? Have you ever, so John, I feel like of the three of us, you might be the most farthest removed from the PR industry. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, I'm definitely, I know how that works, but I've never had hands-on in that thing. And it's interesting. I have a different perspective from the Marketing Over Coffee side too, because we get pitched all the time for content. And we have sponsors that we will create content with. It's an interesting point that kind of ties into what Chris was talking about. And like, I know that there are show sponsors that I can say to them, look, if you sponsor the show, I know we can get 2 good stories from you. We're going to be covering email service providers anyways, and I know you have these good clients, and it changes everything. It becomes regular organic content. But yeah, it's very interesting. It's just fascinating to hear you guys talk about this, and especially like, where could the PR industry go? I mean, what do you guys think about that? Like, is there a way to take the existing model and have them understand that these people can actually become influencers if they become experienced enough in a vertical, or do they just spin off and go and work in those industries as soon as they've got enough clout?
Go ahead, Katie.
Go ahead. I'm curious to see where this goes.
It's both. It is both. I mean, we know a lot of folks who work agency side for a while eventually do go in-house because in-house pays a lot better. But also, there is the PR industry. I forget who I was talking to. I was talking with Kate Bestrova about this the other day. The PR industry doesn't realize the importance of its name, public relations, building relationships with the public. Right. Like a lot of people and a lot of executives at companies think it's actually just media relations. Hey, go pitch these stories to the media. The evolution of public relations is almost disintermediating, going straight to your public. You don't necessarily need a Buzzfeed, a Business Insider, etc. If you've built strong relationships with your community and you have influential people within that community. When you look, for example, at the now 2,000 people that are in the Analytics for Marketers Slack group, right? That is that is our audience, that is our community. Those are the folks who are paying attention, and so our public relations relating to those people, we don't have to work through publication to get there. The In-Ear Insights newsletter with 18,000 subscribers, that is our publication. Now, could we be doing more to be in other people's publications? Yes, 100%. We could be reaching out to more people more often. But even just something as simple as tagging the right people on LinkedIn when we put up a post, because we know that we're talking about, it's going to be relevant. Like when we publish this show on our blog tomorrow, we know that we're going to tag Jenny Dietrich. We're going to tag the SpinSucks community. We'll probably share it in the SpinSucks community itself because the question came from there. We'll probably tag people like Perry Hedrick, who's a good friend of ours, and Joel Richmond, a good friend of ours in the PR industry, to say, hey, we'll love your thoughts on what we talked about on the show. That's public relations, is relating to your public and knowing who those people are. So the evolution of PR is not just flinging more money and trying to be all things to everybody, but saying how good are your relationships with the public directly.
Can I just say for a second, I just have a mini rant. I hate this trend of being tagged in things randomly on social media. Like, if you want my attention, like, send it to me personally, but like just being tagged in something on social media does not guarantee that I'm going to read it, that I'm going to share it. If anything, I'm probably going to ignore it even more because I didn't ask you to do that. So that's my little 2-second rant on that. But I understand what you're saying, Chris. Like, so these are people that you've named that we have relationships with. And so it's not just out of the blue, those, things on Twitter and LinkedIn where you see 800 people tagged and you're like, I don't even know. I forgot what the point of the message was in the first place, because now I'm getting 8 million notifications from people I've never met. And this is all just, a bunch of noise. And so I feel like there's, just like with everything, there's the right way and the wrong way to do it. So if you're going to go that route of tagging people in your posts on social media, then I would definitely caution you to say, make sure it's not people who are going to be pissed off by being tagged in stuff for no good reason. Like, don't just randomly like go to a list of like, okay, it looks like these 5 people are CEOs of companies that I want to get in front of, so let me tag them. Like, don't do that. Make sure they're people you actually have relationships with. And I think that is definitely the difference in terms of, calling what you're talking about public relations, because you have that relationship with someone. You're not just randomly tagging people hoping that they might see it and say, oh, that's interesting.
Exactly. And if you do have those relationships, that is your probably your best alternative to sponsored content, is to know that you can work inside those relationships for stuff that's actually news, that's actually worth talking about, and get the people that you care about to see it. So I would encourage you to look at the SEO tools that you have access to already and see, do some investigation as we showed today. If there's a publication that you think would be interesting for your content to be in, use the SEO tool, look at the traffic. If they have a way for you to detect sponsored versus unsponsored content, repeat the analysis we just did today. Again, you can do it in Excel. It just really takes a little bit longer to do than the way we did it, but you'll get the same outcome. We're just making charts. No machine learning, no statistics, just adding stuff up. So you can totally do that in Excel. Use the SEO tools you have to work at that data, and then make a judgment call. If you see that, on, like we saw with the BBC, that might be your audience, right? If you survey your customers, you survey your community, and they say, yeah, we are diehard fans of the BBC, and like, maybe it's worth that from just a reputation perspective. And then I guess the third part would be, do your public relations well. And as Katie said, make sure you have a story worth sharing so that people are more likely to share it. Any other parting words?
Have a story worth sharing is really all the advice anybody needs on that front.
Maybe that's a topic for another show. How do you know when you have a story worth sharing? All right, folks, take care. We'll see you all next week. Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast and our weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.